So today, let's consider the idea of guilt as a placeholder in grief. I'm Birdi Sinclair, and these are Grief Bites, the second in a free series on grief and loss. Look in the description for links and more info on the rest of it. When we experience guilt as a placeholder in grief, it's worth another look. It's not a face value emotion most of the time. There's something more going on within us. We may be questioning in the front of our mind and heart, are there ways we maybe could have loved differently or better? Probably. There is a comfortableness in many of our relationships. We often will speak to our loved ones in ways that we might never speak to others, for better or worse. Could we have found more time? Yeah, maybe. We might seem to find time for others that we don't find for those we care most about. Were there things done or said or not done or said that we run through? Yeah, maybe our words and actions don't always match with what we hoped for the relationship. But does this mean that we doomed everything? That we failed the whole thing? Probably not. Guilt is a funny beast. Guilt is often thought of as a reflection on the ownership or personal responsibility for our actions or our inactions that caused real or perceived harm, resulting in feelings of remorse, often with some kind of learning and self-improvement, except when it doesn't, because sometimes it stalls along the way. That's a clue that grief is some kind of placeholder for something else. We'll talk a little more about a placeholder for what. So before we get to that, then what happens? If someone's passed, they're not here, there's no path for forgiveness. That seems like the likely next step, some kind of redemption, right? Whatever forgiveness is even about, because that can mean different things to different people. Maybe that's the subject of another series, but we can think about forgiveness as a form of compassion in our context. We're not going to get too into that here, but it's worth spending a moment on. Compassion and forgiveness can work together. I don't mean this next piece as some kind of tongue twister, but we can think of them together in the way of, I don't know you're suffering, but I do know suffering. And I know that you are suffering, even if you don't know you're suffering. I do know when I am unkind, it comes from my suffering. So I can have compassion for your suffering that I know, but do not know. Guilt and what else is true, moving from self-forgiveness, trading it for self-compassion, works similarly. I don't understand my suffering completely, but I know I am suffering, and I understand what it is to suffer. I do know when I am unkind to myself or others, it comes from my suffering. I have or am learning compassion for my suffering that I know but do not know. Take a little time with that. Rewind it. Think about it. I sometimes think it is more difficult to have compassion for ourselves than it is to have for others. So we have to stay present with this practice. We're really, really, really good at arguing with ourselves. We can really get stuck in a mind loop there and think about things over and over and over again. So if it's not about forgiveness, then what do we do with this guilt? It's the perfect placeholder in our minds for an unsolvable problem. The mind is creating an alternative to the endlessness of a loss we cannot otherwise comprehend. then how can we understand this guilt in a way that creates some healing or some movement? Some people are so connected with their guilt that their grieving becomes really complicated and fixed in that spot for years, maybe even a lifetime, and it affects all aspects and relationships in their lives. So let's talk about another path. Let's consider that the mind will create safe spaces for us, even if those spaces are uncomfortable. Why? Because the mind rushes to fix a pain, much like when our body is injured, our body rushes to begin repairing the injury. Sometimes, even something that creates more pain is more comfortable than the alternative. Just taking a minute with that. Think about how many ways in your life that might apply. The mind does what the mind does, and that is in part collects, sorts, compares all the many body spirit inputs and outputs of our lives from moment one and breathes them into some kind of rhythm in every moment. Thoughts are constant. Maybe we catch one here and there, maybe they are focused on our expertise or a task at hand, and when they are not, there is that running dialogue, and we learn to mostly not take it too seriously until we are in need of it or in pain. If we look at our grief and think about the mind doing its job with the pain of, say, the endlessness of a loss or an unresolved hope for a relationship, a complicated relationship or a very woven, love-filled one, there's a chance that guilt is preferred to feeling the endlessness of that loss. What do I mean by this? If we turn on ourselves, we have something tidy, a beginning, a middle, and an end. We can convince ourselves that if we did or said something differently, then something also would have been better or different in the outcome. It seems like a tidy math, and no one can convince us otherwise because it's doing this top secret job. It's a cover story for the actual unsolvable problem, so we can't give it up. It's also often easier to turn on ourselves than it is to turn on or address someone else. Like, might feel like a conflict or something that we want to avoid. And also, sometimes we're not experiencing guilt, but some form of blame. If we blame a partner, a doctor, a sibling, a treatment, maybe even the one who's passed fiercely, this is kind of the same thing. It's a placeholder in the way of actual grief. Maybe we're doing both and or holding intense other convincing mind formations. It's doing the same job in the way that it's keeping us from feeling the loss, the anger, the sadness, the disappointment, the hope that we had for things that could come, whatever bundle of deep feelings we have, as well as integrating the wholeness of our relationship and embodying them into ourselves as we relate to who they are to us, how we're more for knowing them, and continue to recognize them in our lives going forward, which is what happens in grief. Um, this is what it's keeping us from. It can sneak up on us in many years later on an anniversary or a special occasion when we hadn't thought this way before. We could be rolling along just fine. Years go by, we've experienced this grief, but then next thing you know, something comes along, like a special occasion, a birthday, grandchildren. I experienced this myself on the 10th anniversary of my mother's passing. It took me about 3 weeks to level off again. The years had gone by so quickly, but something about it was still so stunning that my mind created this huge guilty story formation. It held me in place until I could grieve her again and allow myself to feel the deep sorrow of time whizzing by, and even my anger at all the experiences we just didn't get to have. Yeah, I was convinced that I had somehow done something wrong by her, and I felt this terrible guilt and shame. And it took me about 3 weeks to resolve that within myself. My logical mind knew that, of course, this wasn't the case. And, I had to take time and come to terms to understand that the loss of her was kicking back strong and sharp, and that was really the issue under the issue, that it really wasn't guilt and shame. It was just the incredible pain of her not being there in all the ways that I had wanted her to be there. Another thing it does is to protect us, which is what that guilt and shame was trying to do. If we are clinging to this mat, these feelings, they're isolating, they're insulating, and the rest of our relationships can become distance. We are shielded. This is oversimplified in a complex process, but please consider how we were in a grief state. Much is rippled into our circles of relationships. We will touch on this in our next visit, but it distances us from others. Maybe we're trying to somehow keep ourselves from ever feeling a pain like this again. So for now, again, consider how these placeholders may also serve to unknowingly protect you from well-meaning people, from those you question, from those you dearly love, and fear losing. What else is true? Is there a deeper conversation that some part of you may want to have about your fears and your anxieties of love and loss, of worthiness, of anxiety, of relationships, and more that is just too numerous to list here? Take your time, be still, be gentle, be curious. There is no hurry. Have those conversations that your beautiful whole self is wanting to have with you, because it's in some ways trying to protect you. It doesn't know what else to do until you have those conversations with yourself. Honor this with curiosity, with compassion, a tenderness, and a love for the wonder of our universal design. Even if you're having trouble with a clarity of feeling anything much at the moment. Leo Tolstoy wrote, "Only people who are capable of loving strongly can also suffer a great sorrow. But this same necessity of loving serves to counteract their grief and heals them." I'm Reverend Dr. Birdi Sinclair of Begin Peace. Begin peace because every moment is new. We can begin now, and then a new moment arrives, and we can begin peace again and again. It is not a pass-fail. I am here with you. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.